we still talk about boys in this quite limiting way. Like, as a mother of boys, I hear it all the time. Boys are like dogs. All they need is like exercise and food and just like wear them out. Or like, boys are simple. Or boys can't sit still. Boys don't like reading. Boys, so it's all this stuff. And it's not that there's no truth in it. I think there is sort of cultural truth in some of those like stereotypes, but it's just, I think we've started to see boys in this very limited way. And this is still very, very true in our culture. We think we've changed, and it's not like, we're beating boys out of their emotions, but we're still communicating this narrative in so many subtle ways to them.
There's so much stereotypes, and I think there's so much about, that tough guy, and it does so much more harm than good to raise children, and especially our boys, with this sort of mentality.
Men have all this power, everything's great for them, so it's fine to stereotype them, it's fine to make fun of them, it's fine to like limit them. But actually, I don't think it is fine. I think boys are losing out massively in terms of like social and emotional stuff in our culture. Really important, the ability to make connections, the ability to be in touch with our own emotions and emotional life.
Welcome to PedsDocTalk TV and this episode of the PedsDocTalk Podcast, where you can catch my amazing conversations with guests on the show here on my YouTube channel, or if you prefer audio only, wherever you access podcasts. I'm Dr. Mona Amin, a board-certified pediatrician, lactation consultant, and mom of 2, and I'm here to uplift, support, and guide you so you can raise those incredible kids. Let's get to today's amazing conversation.
Welcome back to the PedsDocTalk Podcast. You are joining me on our YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all of my future conversations with future guests coming on the show. And I'm excited to welcome Ruth Whippman. She is a feminist writer, culture critic, and mother of 3 boys, and author of Boy Mom: Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ruth.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I am excited. I was chatting with you before we recorded that I discovered your book after a friend had shared it on her stories. And I was like, this is great. I have 1 boy, 1 girl, but I love reading things about perspective of boy moms and what it is. And then I took a deeper dive into what your book was about. And it was more than just boy mom. It's about breaking a lot of this, again, masculinity, the culture that has come up in raising boys from past generations. And also we see it now. And I'm just so excited to share your wisdom with my listeners. But before we get into this amazing conversation, tell us more about yourself and the inspiration for your book.
So, as you said in your intro, I am a writer, a journalist. I've always identified as a feminist. I've always been very much in pushing the cause of women's rights, women's equality, all the rest of it. And then I am also a mother of 3 boys. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I think those identities are very much aligned, feminist and mother of boys, and they should be aligned, but sometimes they can feel in conflict. And I think that's that tension and those kind of complicated, conflicted feelings that was really what inspired me to write this book. My 3rd son was born right as the Me Too movement was exploding. And we had just had this huge cultural reckoning around masculinity, toxic masculinity, boys, men. And it became so heavily politicized that, for me, it was what was happening in the home. It was what was happening in the culture. And I just wanted to dig into all of it and just be really honest about the conflicts and difficulties involved. It's not simple.
I love it. And I love that you are giving the perspective of being someone who's who describes yourself as a feminist, who has 3 boys. And you just said it perfectly, that it applies to all of us, right? I think people think that, feminism, that you have daughters, and that's no, but how are we going to teach our boys how to survive in this culture? And the reason I love your book is that you not only tackle the societal expectations, you tackle, like you just alluded to, the political, how this has impacted politics, and also how it impacts mental health for boys, especially.
Absolutely,
and I think this is like, I'm gushing as I just get into this conversation because I always feel the same. I think there's so much stereotypes, and I think there's so much about, that tough guy, and it does so much more harm than good to raise children, and especially our boys, with this sort of mentality. But one of the things that you talk about in your book, society often celebrates girls with messages like, you can do anything. And, with boys, they continue to essentialize boys through phases like, boys will be boys. That's just them being a boy. How do these narratives limit boys' potential, and what new language should we be using when we discuss boys?
So again, it's a really complicated thing because obviously all
Mhm.
those messages about the future is female, you can do
Yeah.
anything, the sky's the limit for girls are coming from a great place, which is for centuries girls were oppressed and told they couldn't do anything and
Yeah.
boys could do everything. So we see why that happened. But I think in this cultural moment, we have a very inspiring narrative and very inspiring language in the way that we talk about girls, and rightly so. I'm all for it. But we still talk about boys in this quite limiting way. Like, as a mother of boys, I hear it all the time. Boys are like dogs. All they need is like exercise and food and just like wear them out. Or like boys are simple, or boys can't sit still. Boys don't like reading,
Yeah.
boys, so it's all this stuff. And it's not that there's no truth in it. I think there is sort of cultural truth in some of those like stereotypes, but it's just, I think we've started to see boys in this very limited way. And the ways in which, they have, I think we talk a lot about power and success and be the CEO and be the Supreme Court Justice and whatever for girls. But I think where boys have historically lost out is more things like in terms of emotional vulnerability, connection, social skills, those sort of softer skills. But because we don't value those skills, we don't really see it as a loss. So it's kind of fine to be like, in our culture, to be like, oh, boys don't need that stuff. They're just these simple little dogs, these simple little creatures, and not really think about where they're losing out and how we could talk about them in a more expansive way.
Absolutely. And I see that. I am raising a boy and a girl, and the stereotypes that come from external, from my in-laws, from my parents, more so my in-laws, I shouldn't say that, but I see it, like my boy really loves to play with unicorns and he's very sensitive, and I'm sensitive, and my husband's very sensitive. And the comments that are made to my son, but that are not made to my daughter, it's so mind-boggling, but it's what I've always known. But when you see it in front of you happening to children that you're trying to raise to be emotionally intelligent, to be good members of society, to love, and you get these outward, commentary, it really is in your face like, wow, this is really prevalent in 2024 still.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the movie Inside Out, the franchise. There's Inside Out and Inside Out
love
2.
it. Yeah.
And it was like, it's a great movie. And it's like this whole world of like complex interiority for this girl and, her emotions and how she tracks her mom's emotions and her friends' emotions and how her mom tracks her emotions. And every time a male character comes on the screen, there's the same joke. It's just like you go inside the dad's head, or like the boy he was in the first movie, this sort of boyfriend. And it's just like, duh, we don't have any emotions, like all the emotions and it's very essentializing. And we think it's funny because we think it's like punching up as a joke. It's like, men have all this power, everything's great for them. So it's fine to stereotype them. It's fine to make fun of them. It's fine to like limit them. But actually, I don't think it is fine. I think boys are losing out massively in terms of like social and emotional stuff in our culture. Really important, the ability to make connections, the ability to be in touch with our own emotions and emotional life. And to just be like, oh, boys don't need that, they're just dumb and idiotic, is really giving them a really problematic message, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that it goes on to what I was just going to ask about, like you mentioned in your book, like there's subtle ways that boys are being taught that emotional labor and relationship management are for girls, and how does this impact their ability to form healthy emotional relationships as they grow up?
Yeah, so I noticed it first. So, when I had my first two sons, I was really kind of blind to all this. I just didn't flag it in the culture.
Yeah.
But then I remember I was with my three boys. We were in the bookstore. We saw this magazine and it was like clearly aimed at girls. It had this like pink sparkly cover and like a friendship bracelet giveaway. And I looked in the magazine, and the first story was about this girl who'd been invited to these two birthday parties. They were happening at the same time. She was really stressed out. She didn't want to disappoint either one of the friends and not go to the birthday party. So she concocted this scheme, and she was like running between the two parties and going to one and then having the cake and going back to the other one and playing the games. And I was like, this is emotional labor. And my boys will never read a story with a boy character doing that kind of work.
Right.
Every girl will read a million stories about friendships and emotions and relationships and like drama and community in that way. And all the stories that my boys read are about fighting and battles and competition. There's a hero, there's a villain, someone's a hero, someone gets killed. And so story by story, we are giving girls the message that this kind of emotional work is their responsibility. So in one sense, it's really hard on girls and women that they take on too much of this kind of labor. But actually, boys and men are really missing out, because those things are the fundamentals of intimacy and human connection. And we're giving them the message that this is not for them.
Absolutely. And I know this is going to feel like not related, but it is. Like, we look at homelessness. Like, homelessness in America, there's way more homeless men than there are women. And,
Yes.
people are like, why is that? Why is male? And it's a cultural narrative that women are more likely to seek help. We'll get into all
Yes.
that mental health stuff. Women are more likely not to fall onto the streets because
Yes.
they have community, they have resources.
Yes.
They're more likely to, like you said, have the relationship management, have the
Yes.
emotional labor that impacts us in so many ways. And again, create friendships and connection.
And helps us stay connected and part of a community. Like, boys are not encouraged to see themselves as part of a community. They're encouraged to see themselves as the hero on his journey who will save the day. And it doesn't build those skills that you actually need to be a connected human being. And there is a crisis with male loneliness at the moment, with older adolescent boys and men. And I see it with my friendships versus my husband's friendships. I see it with like all the adult men I know in my life in America who are really struggling with connection.
Yeah.
And it's a serious problem.
My husband is very open about this. He is. Like, we literally 2 nights ago had a big conversation about how he's lonely. And when he said those words to me, I was like, thank you for telling me. He's like, I'm really lonely. And I was like, I love you, but I don't have any good friends that I can talk to about my feelings. And how pure and sweet. I'm getting teary-eyed because he's a grown man. He's successful in his career, but he doesn't have that. And I think, going into what you were talking about, that friendship crisis amongst young men, but also older men, like my, people in their 40s, how do the cultural narratives around masculinity push boys away from forming these intimate relationships? And what can we do as parents to address this?
So I think it's a combination of what we don't teach boys and what we do teach boys. So the don't teach boys piece is what we've just been talking about. So they don't get those stories about relationships, about friendships, about solving friendship narratives. And if those do show up in their movies and books and shows, they're kind of a little subplot that just kind of happens before they go off on the big adventure. So that kind of piece is missing for them. But then they also get this story about masculinity, which is be tough, be strong, suppress your emotions, don't, be kind of bulletproof in that way. Don't be vulnerable. Being vulnerable is emasculating.
Yeah.
And for Boy Mom, I interviewed a huge range of boys, really different backgrounds, different races, different social and economic classes. And they all had the same language around it. They all said, I can't be vulnerable with my friends. And that's a real problem. And it got to the point where they couldn't even identify those kind of emotions in themselves. They were so used to suppressing them. And this is a process that starts from babyhood, that we encourage girls to sort of express their emotions, to feel their emotions, to talk about them, share them. We engage, as parents, as adults, we engage with girls around their emotions so much more than we do with boys. So it's this process, it builds and builds. And then by adulthood, they really are struggling with that. And this is still very, very true in our culture. We think we've changed, and it's not like, we're beating boys out of their emotions, but we're still communicating this narrative in so many subtle ways to them.
I see it. Like I said, I have a young boy who's very sensitive to his feelings, and he's only 4.5 or almost 5 at the time of this recording, and he is very insightful. And I'm very proud of us as parents for raising a child who has that emotional intelligence at only 5 years of age. But I find my husband getting frustrated with him sometimes when he is being more sensitive. And I turn to him and I'm like, he understands his feelings. Like, this is our perceptions on what we feel. When Vera, my daughter, is the same age and does it, I'm pretty sure you're going to think differently, and you're going to say, "Oh, sweetie, what is it? You're a girl." And I'm watching that. I'm very attuned to that because I know that there is a sex difference here. The fact that they're boys and girls, and how they're, like I said earlier, perceived by not only society but parents too, right? Because of the cultural pressures we've been fed growing up.
Absolutely.
You can't do that.
Yeah, it's really, there's so much research on this that shows, and there's this classic study that they did in the 70s that they gave babies to adults, and they didn't say what they were neutrally dressed in just a
Yes.
diaper. They didn't know if they were boys or girls. They told half the adults that they were holding a boy, half that they were holding a girl. And when that baby cried, if they believed they were holding a boy, regardless of what this child actually was, if they believed they were holding a boy, they interpreted their cries as anger. And if they thought they were holding a girl, when the baby cried, they thought they were scared. And it's already, you're masculinizing, you're projecting all these qualities. And that goes on, that same principle all the way through childhood. We attribute anger to our sons. We don't engage with them as much about their emotions. We use different language. When you analyze the vocabulary that parents use with boys versus girls, they use emotion words with girls at far higher rates and kind of competition and winning type vocabulary with boys. Dads, especially, I think dads know the kind of costs of, being weak or vulnerable. So they want to sort of help their sons be tough and man up. They do it out of love, but I think it's misguided.
Absolutely. I agree. I think it is. And I think it, in the end, will do more harm than good. And you talk about the, official surveys show that girls report higher levels of mental health challenges, but then you argue that boys actually face a silent epidemic of depression. Can you elaborate on what that means and what it shows and what we can do to change that?
So there's this issue of underreporting when it comes to male mental health. And it's for the same reason why men are struggling with their mental health, which is they're not allowed to be in touch with their emotions. They're not allowed to express them or name them. So if someone, is taking a survey and they're like, are you feeling depressed? A girl has been socialized for many years to be like, oh, yes, and these are the feelings I'm having, and let me tell you about them. Whereas a boy has been socialized to that point to say, I'm fine. There's no problem. I'm not depressed. And to see depression or anxiety is something really shameful that they shouldn't admit to. And so, and I noticed this when I was interviewing boys, it takes a really long time to get them to express this stuff. They will eventually, but if you're doing a checkbox survey, it's not going to come up. And so there's a real problem with underreporting of male mental health problems. And I think also it's like often because we don't give boys those channels to express their sadness, and their feelings of depression, it often comes out in boys as like increased aggression or substance use problems or bad behavior.
Yeah.
And then we compound that. So it's sort of like this vicious circle where we don't give them ways to express it as sadness. And so they express it in these other ways. Then we don't see it as a mental health problem and we discipline them. And, so we tend to see boys as bad, not sad.
I love that you just talked about the unhealthy coping skills. Like you talked about, turning to alcohol, drugs. And I think this conversation is so important because I don't think many parents realize the harm that this can cause to young men. Like, when you're raising a little boy and you say, don't cry or don't, we're not encouraging the feelings. I think people are not realizing what kind of man we're raising in this world because they're so focused on the now, right? They're focused on, well, okay, just I need to move in the moment. They're bothering, they're annoying. But you are right on that this is about how is that little boy going to learn how to cope when every person in their life told them that it's not okay to feel.
Absolutely. And they're not, and they're getting that message in so many different ways. So even if you're not directly saying to your son, it's not okay to feel, which probably not many people are saying, but it's these indirect messages from everything they're watching, everything they're reading, the way that the adults respond to them, what they get rewarded for, what they get sort of subtly punished for. And so, it has this huge impact down the line. And every boy that I spoke to and interviewed for this book mentioned it in one way or another. And I think now there's even this new cultural pressure because the old pressure was like, man up, don't express your feelings. That's an age-old thing for men. But now I think there's this new narrative where it's like toxic masculinity, you're so privileged, everything, you benefit from everything. This system really works for you. Shut up, be quiet. Time to let everybody else have a turn to talk, which is right in one sense. We do need to give other people and other communities, other genders a voice. But at the same time, it's not as though everybody's been listening to men's feelings all along. They've listened to their opinions, but not so much to their feelings.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, this is so insightful. I cannot wait to read the book. I mean, I said it earlier, but I found out about your book. It's en route to get here, and I am just so excited to really dive in and go, yes, I feel this. And especially like you said, because even though this is a book about boys, like it matters for like you said being a feminist writer, like it matters for me in this world trying to raise women who may be with boys in their future, right? In terms of relationships,
Absolutely.
I want the best for everybody that encounters a boy. And I want the best for these boys too, so that they don't grow up
Yeah.
in this cycle of like feeling like they can't be, and that they're just
Yes.
bottled up with aggression and anger that they couldn't process.
It's so true. And, I think sometimes it's this tendency to see it as a zero-sum game. It's like, if we benefit boys, then we're taking away from girls and women. And
No.
it's not the case. To raise a generation of emotionally healthy men will benefit everybody. It's a huge deal when it comes to violence. The kind of
Yeah.
messages we give boys about masculinity and shame and who they need to be is causing, it's one of the key drivers of male violence against women. This is not in opposition to the feminist ideal. This is very much part of it.
I would love to hear like more about that, like in terms of the narrative of masculinity makes it feel like they're dominant to women and that's why there's violence, or what is it that makes them feel like that is how they're going to,
Yeah.
communicate with their partner or someone else, like a female? How does that violence connection come in?
So what is one of the most fascinating things that I found out when I was doing the research is that it's not so much masculinity itself,
Mhm.
the sort of be dominant, be strong, although that comes into it. The one of the biggest drivers of violence is this feeling of shame. So it's this feeling that you're not masculine enough. There's this like ideal that you have to be like a real man, that you have to meet this like, and in the title of the book, I call it Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. And it's this idea that you have to be totally tough, strong, never show any weakness, never show any flaws. And I think it's when men start to feel that shame that they're not meeting that standard,
Yeah.
that is when violence starts to happen. And there's all these studies that show, they call this masculine discrepancy stress. So it's kind of this fancy way of describing this feeling of shame and emasculation that you're not meeting the standards. And when men feel very stressed about that, that is when they start to commit domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence. And also, you see it in the school shootings. That's the kind of classic profile. A boy who feels like he's not meeting society's standards for manhood, that he's not a real man, that he's emasculated, he's ashamed. And that's when they go out and get a gun and shoot, a bunch of people to kind
Yeah.
of reclaim that lost masculinity. It's
You
tragic.
It's tragic. I mean, it's exactly what I feel, and you're obviously I wouldn't be I'm not surprised that you put it so eloquently into words on this show, but also in that book, because it is such a sad reality that we see. And we're blaming all these other things, like this is the reason, but what is happening here with the kids that we're raising here? It's like definitely an
Yeah.
issue. And one of the biggest things that I love that you chatted about was this drive for young boys and men from Gen Z and Gen Alpha to increasingly identify as conservative, especially as their way of rejecting feminism. And I think about like the most successful media stars, like Andrew Tate, who I don't know if
Yeah.
people are familiar, or even Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
This sort of like culture of manlyhood and like rejecting evidence. Like, I mean, so many of
Yeah.
these people are like rejecting evidence-based medicine. I'm like, why are we going so extreme?
Yeah.
Are there societal, cultural, educational shifts that contribute to that? Like, why is it that this generation is seemingly doing that as a way of reclaiming themselves, or what?
So I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of complicated things going on here. So the Andrew Tates of this world are really sort of tapping into something that boys have been primed to feel right from birth. So if you listen to Andrew Tate's videos, he uses a lot of like superhero metaphors. He's like always going on about how I'm Batman, I'm in a bat cave, I'm an alpha, I have all these fast cars. And these are all the tropes of boyhood
Yeah.
that we encourage boys, be a superhero. And we haven't interrogated them very much. So, we've sort of talked a lot about like princess culture for girls and how it can give bad images, bad body image messages, bad messages about agency, about being rescued. We haven't really interrogated that kind of superhero masculinity trope for boys. So Andrew Tate's already tapping into this sort of fear and need that's already there in boys. And I think in this particular cultural moment, this micro generation of boys that were going through puberty when the Me Too movement happened, they're now of voting age. They have spent their entire adolescence in the kind of shadow of this conversation about toxic masculinity. They've heard over and over again, you're bad, you're harmful, time to shut up, you're so privileged. And they're like, this isn't how I feel. It's like the old story and the new story. The old story, is telling them to man up, squash their emotions. The new story is telling them to be quiet. They're so privileged. Everything's great for them. They're toxic. They're harmful. And I think they're pushing back. They're like, this is impossible. I don't know how to be. Here's someone telling me how I can just straightforwardly be a man, be an alpha, be all those things that, that I've been told that I have to be. And it's pulling them in. And I think that if the left and the feminist movement wants to engage boys, we have to stop telling them that they suck and they're terrible.
Right.
Nobody's going to go for that. What group is going to be like, great, I'm going to latch on to this.
Let's
That's great. You hate me. So therefore, we need to find a narrative that recognizes that things are hard for boys too, and that gives them some empathy and some grace.
Yeah. And, talking about the Me Too movement that you mentioned earlier, I mean, obviously, do you see how that has created any negative perception for men, or like, has that been mostly positive in your opinion, or what have you seen?
It's a really tricky question because obviously I am and this is where I open the book. I open the book when I'm giving birth to a third son, right as the Me Too movement is exploding. And the feminist part of me is like, wonderful. Women have a voice. Finally, we're speaking out about these things. Nobody has been listening. I feel like we've been saying this forever. No one's been listening. We haven't been taken seriously. So I'm so glad that happened. I'm so glad that women have that voice. I'm so glad that sexual predators are being called out.
Yeah.
But I think what resulted was this narrative about boys and men that was so negative. And it's understandable where it came from. We have righteous anger. But for this generation of boys, they didn't do those things. They were not part of it. It's psychologically so unhealthy to grow up sort of being written off as a person before you even get started, being told that you're toxic and harmful. And I think that we really, really need to talk about boys in a new and different and more hopeful way.
I love that. And I feel the same way. I feel like, I obviously, I have a husband. So the only really men I talked to about it was that. And I said, I'm like, this is really important. And, his thing is like, there was a feeling of culture of like, well, what are we, what is it going to look like? What is it going to feel like? And how are we, what is this messaging? And I love how you talked about how if the left wants to get male voters, they can't talk about how they suck. And I think there was an extreme movement that happened where, of course, we want to embrace the real violence that was happening, sexual violence, harm, all of that, but not putting all men in that group and saying, all boys are just like that together, and saying, well, all of y'all are just out to get me and stuff like that, when it's not all boys. Like, you are raising, I imagine, 3 amazing boys, and I would love to ask just a follow-up question about that. I hope to be raising an amazing boy and an amazing girl that understands that they're more than just the chromosome that they were given.
Right.
But you're right. I love that, changing how we talk to our boys about being boys. And as a boy mom, my last question maybe, how has it been raising boys with this understanding and insight that you have in a world that isn't caught up with you? Meaning, you are obviously very enlightened, and I love this, and I love this conversation, and I feel right on with you in terms of relating to you. But do you ever get frustrated? Like, you're trying to raise these boys, and you're like, everyone, just freaking read my book, and can you do the same thing with your boys? How do you navigate being a boy mom, having written this amazing book?
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for that, those kind words. I mean, this book is very much a journey. So if you read it, you'll see that all the way through, I'm like conflicted, and I'm like, well, and I'm going way over to the one side of the argument and then way back to the other. And I really write through all those conflicted feelings. And sometimes I'm like, but, and my own boys, we're pretty in line with a lot of those stereotypes. So I'm like, I want them to embrace their feelings and talk about their feelings and nurture and all of that. And they're often like super into like Nerf guns and battle stories. And, so I write through all those conflicts and I try to embrace the fact that this is complicated. And I am definitely not some like enlightened guru who's like, do what I say, follow my way, and your boys will turn out perfect. It's complicated, and kids are people who don't always do the exact thing that you say, and they don't want to sort of step in line with your agenda. And so I feel like for me, it's been a journey. For me, it's been kind of a long game. And there have been moments along the way where I've been like, oh God, I can't believe I'm writing about boys. And here's my own boys like pummeling each other on their living room rug. And how can I take any claim to be any kind of expert, which I don't. I'm not an expert. I'm a mom and a journalist who's trying to figure this stuff out. But, what I will say is that this, in the longer term, this stuff has really paid off with my boys. They're so thoughtful and sweet. And some of the things when I was despairing when they were 5, 6, 7, now they're like 14 and 11, the older two, and my youngest is 6. And they're, I see the seeds of what I planted, starting to flower. And it's really special and lovely to watch.
How beautiful. I love that. I love it. I have younger children, but I love hearing that perspective and, obviously having this amazing book out there and, how you connect that with your own personal life. I really appreciate you answering that very personal question. It means a lot. I think a lot of parents listening, again, you said it perfectly, think that authors and doctors and professionals have it all right, but we're all doing the best that we can, but we love to share the information that we have and what we feel is right. And I love that you are doing that with this book. And one of the things that I ask all of my guests is, share a final uplifting message for everyone listening. This is a message, after we discuss all these things, a final take home that really can just, leave people with a happy feeling in their heart. What would you say related to this conversation that you would want to share with my listeners today?
So I feel very hopeful. I believe that change can happen. We have seen change when it comes to women, when it comes to LGBTQ rights, where we know that cultural change can happen. I've seen it in my lifetime and I want to see it with boys. And I feel very hopeful that if we keep having these conversations, if we keep talking about it, if we keep trying, if we keep, trying and failing and trying again, then this change will happen.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. And put that book up again for any of our listeners.
Here it is.
If you're tuning in on YouTube, you can see the book. I will be obviously linking that as well. Tell people where they can purchase the book and obviously how they can stay connected with your work and your mission.
So you can buy the book anywhere that you buy books, and you can find me. I write a Substack. It's called I Blame Society, where I write about a lot of these issues to do with boyhood and men and gender and feminism and some other stuff too. So you can find me on Substack or at my website, ruthwhipman.com, and Ruth Whippman on Instagram.
Thank you, Ruth, so much. I will be linking all of these resources that she mentioned in our show notes, as well as in our YouTube channel comment section and caption as well. But this was an incredible conversation. And please get this book. Like I said, even if it's not something that was even on your radar, you're like, it doesn't matter. It does matter. Like what she just said and the discussion that we had. This is so important for boys, for females, and for society. So thank you, Ruth, for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. If you love this conversation, make sure to hit that thumbs up sign, share this episode on your social media channels, and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on all future episodes and our weekly educational videos. Have questions or comments? Make sure to comment below, and I'll see you all next time. Stay well, stay loved, and keep on shining.